you get to write the examination question and then answer it yourself, of course. So morning, everyone. It's good to see some familiar faces in the room. So for those that don't know me, we haven't met before, my name is Chris. I teach on financial regulation compliance and occasionally on commercial law as a freelance lecturer. I practice in the city, and and again, for those of you that I do recognise from when you started on the course, you'll recall that I said that I've sat where you've sat before. So I've done this course about a decade or so ago. Embarrassing that may sound, and so I know what it's like. I know what BPP expects from the student side of the fence, as well as now supervising dissertations. And so the purpose of this lecture, and again when we reconvene for the second half, is to talk you through that expectation for your dissertations, and specifically on how you go about legal research methods. I appreciate, of course, that you're now well versed in legal research, having done, if you weren't prior to the LLM by virtue of your examinations and MOAs. But of course, this is a thesis, a dissertation, so a slightly different approach needs to be adopted. A more formulaic approach needs to be adopted to your research methods, and in the way in which you go about this. Whilst the title of this is it's a lecture, but please, as always, interrupt me if you've got any questions as we're going along. I don't try to focus too much on research methods in isolation, because I don't really feel that gives a lot of context, and this is a very important part, which is of course the writing side of it. Okay, so it's one of the fundamental tenets that you have to sort of adopt when you're going about preparing your dissertations, is to ensure that you do right as you do your research, as you're making notes. Okay, an obvious point, but some do come back to me and to colleagues saying, I've read so much, I'm more confused than I was at the beginning now. How do I go about bringing this all together in some sort of clear and coherent way that is persuasive and engaging to read? So we certainly focus on the technique in getting down the words on the paper as you go through your research. All right. So this first hour, we'll focus on what you really need to be doing now if you haven't already started. I talk about the research proposal, doing some preliminary research, finding out what has been written on your subject matter. You will not necessarily have your research question clearly articulated, focused to the same degree as you will at the end. I'd be very surprised if anybody has already identified the title that they end up with. Okay, you may well come at this having already had some subject matter expertise, and that is great. You offer a starter for 10 on that. But a point of advice is to be prepared, to be persuaded by your research. Okay. Come full circle, argue the point 180 degrees in the opposite direction if the research supports that argument. Okay? You may well find that when you've done preliminary research and that an issue you thought was worthy of a dissertation, and some critical thinking around that had already been pretty well written on through existing literature. Maybe there was a law commission paper on it, and it led to legislation dealing with that issue, and you just didn't know that when you embarked on that piece of research. But the process has identified that, so then allow yourself to iterate that question, okay, and focus it as you go along. It is not just a matter of how long have you got. It's 10 weeks, isn't it? It's a module, right? You've got about 10 weeks, give or take, to do this. So it's not about identifying your question, researching for 8 weeks and spending 2 weeks writing up. Okay, as I'll go through this, there's a bit of technique. You identify what's been written on the subject already. You start creating your notes. You pull that into some structure. Start thinking about the research questions and the issues that are coming out, and allow yourself to move it around as you identify what the key topics are. We'll talk about the sources. Just again, a bit of a refresher. Okay, and obviously we'll look to look at a literature review, focus on what you need to do in order to really start getting together that library of sources and research and applying them to answering the research question. And then when we reconvene, I'll go through the discipline of methodological approaches, okay? Taking doctrinal approach through to historical comparative approaches to give you not necessarily, and certainly not an instruction as to how to approach it, okay? But just in talking about it, it's more to get you thinking about the way in which you could use the sources to answer the question, okay? You may want to introduce a comparative element to the dissertation. You may want to take in a different jurisdiction, or maybe an issue that is being dealt with in a different subject matter, but in a similar way. So the tools of legal certainty have been used in a particular way here. I'm going to use them to see if it's a means to resolving an issue I've identified elsewhere. So it's not all about comparing one jurisdiction from another. That's just one metric that you might use. So a comparative research approach might be a good one. I won't focus too much on primary legal research methods when we come back. You can, of course, go out and interview, set a questionnaire out, and obtain some primary research results yourselves. But you do only have 10 weeks in which to do it, and there is, in order for it to stand up to sort of academic rigour, then you need to adopt a certain process and work closely with your supervisors around pulling together interviews and interview process and the questionnaires. I'll talk about that in brief, but it may well be that you can identify what you need in terms of the data from other sources where others have already done that and had the time and resources to do so. The structure of research papers. Often students are concerned, is there a structure? Do I need, an introduction, a literature review, followed by analysis, followed by results and conclusion? Yes, you could adopt that approach, but the structure really depends on how the research question's formulated and the issues fall out of that, and I'll talk about that a little bit further. And then we'll end with some tips for good research practice, which I've used in the past, using practice as well as when I'm writing academically, as to how about just to practically organise yourselves when you're doing the research, all right? And yes, at the end of the second lecture, I'll let you have a look at what the dissertation that I pulled together some time ago, just to give you a sense of, I guess, what one looked like for BPP, but with that big sort of qualification being that it answered my research question, not your research questions. Okay, so it's not a question of just simply adopting it and running with that. Any questions as far? No. Okay, so as many of you will know, okay, it's a research assignment. It's worth 60 credits. Okay, it's an opportunity to research a topic of interest within the subject matter of your core LLM. So yes, if you're doing commercial law, you have to do something that is related to commercial law. Similarly, financial crime and financial regulation compliance, and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that you haven't got some latitude. Okay, talk to your supervisors if you wanted to have a look at a particular topic of interest to you, because you know, what I would say is that identify that topic that is truly of interest, rather than you feel like you can answer it quickly. Okay, because the more engaged you are, the better the dissertation will be. And if that means you need to look at a subject matter slightly outside on its face of your core LLM, talk to your supervisor about doing something like that and how you may relate it back to the core module. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to come out of a question that arose during the seminar within your core module. Okay, and by the nature of the modules that we run on at BPP, quite a few of them interrelate as well. So I'm sure you'll be able to find something that will satisfy that test. Not a 10,000 word description of your chosen topic. I had one student that said, "Chris, I really want to do something on joint ventures." Okay, quite what the rationale for that was, but it was okay, fantastic. Can you give me an indicative content? Can you tell me roughly what do you want to do around joint ventures? Because it can be applied to any number of different scenarios and contexts. So then about a week or so later, I received a 4-page, very detailed, well put together contents on everything you could possibly think about to talk about related to a joint venture. It was a table of contents that more befitted sort of a treatise on the subject matter. So I was like, well, okay, fine, but if it's that broad, you're going to spend so much time describing the various issues and topics that you're not going to be able to get in the analysis and critique and be argumentative and persuasive in pursuit of your hypothesis. You're going to spend so much more time just setting out context. So really work to narrow your question down. So in the end, for example, we didn't just look at joint ventures, but we, through some meetings and just general discussion, the student was particularly interested in how a fiduciary duty within a joint venture context. So we constructed a case study where they just looked at the implication of imposing a fiduciary duty on 2 corporates that enter into a joint venture. So you can see it narrowed it down quite specifically. And then, whilst it enabled, you presented that case study, and then you could talk to that case study throughout the analysis, but draw in the fundamental concepts as you go through. It worked quite well. But that enabled you to really get that analysis and application, rather than just simply spending 10,000 words. And another point, you have 10,000 words to identify and narrow specific issues I've talked about. Set the context, so why the issue deserves analysis. Okay, so don't just say this. I'm going to talk about this topic. Okay, part of this LLM dissertation is to present an argument to resolve an issue that you've identified. Okay, so set that issue out. Don't just set the parameters of the subject matter. Tell the reader, this is a problem, this is an issue. Okay, this is uncertain, there's disagreements in this area. This dissertation sets out to provide clarity on this particular matter of interpretation. Okay, or sets out to propose reform that looks as follows. So you have to make sure you state your hypothesis. Okay, that's your position that you intend to draw out. So when just quickly segueing into structure, when you come to put in your introduction together, which of course you may, depending on how you want to approach it. I always quite like identifying the issue, doing a little bit of research. Notes make no sense to anybody other than myself. And then start pulling together an introduction. I try to write the introduction first. A lot of people say write the introduction last. I try to write the introduction first as a draft, okay? Because it helps me start to think about all the issues. And then I put it to one side, continue with the research, and then of course you come back to rewrite. And it is a matter of rewriting the introduction. I don't know how many of you in the room can relate, but there's often when you've done some research and you know broadly what you're talking about, when you start writing, putting something into an introduction, you often find that actually I'm concluding there, and you end up putting it into a conclusion. The point I'm making here is that when you come back to write your introduction, the introduction should say, this is the topic, this is the issue, these, this is how I'm going to go about addressing it, and this dissertation, defends that or sets out the reasons for, and it should always be read as though you already knew the answer. Okay. And then structure your chapters to develop the analysis of the issues. So you can say these are a number of the issues. I'm going to set a context, and I'm going to deal with that, and then I'm going to do an analysis over a couple of chapters, and then I'll conclude. That's absolutely fine. You may equally say my research question begs a number of sub-issues. Okay, deal with each of those issues in turn. So set their context, set out the arguments for and against, and conclude. And then you run each issue into another before you're able to conclude in full. And then another point, and I always feel when I give this lecture is obviously, Chris, it's a bit of a stating the blind and the obvious, but we see it time and time again in dissertations, and I'm sure it's nobody that attends this lecture, but a failure to actually to conclude or to introduce new analysis in the concluding chapter. Okay. So do make sure if you're setting, your purpose out in your introduction and you've drawn the analysis and you're making conclusions as you go through, that you summarise it and you answer the hypothesis, okay, in that conclusion. So pulling these aspects together is what you should be thinking about now. You don't have all the answers, of course. You've not done any of the research yet, or you may have only just started. But you have an idea of what you need to do. So for those that I'm supervising, I always ask, please, whatever you think of as your topic, do a little bit of research. Try and identify a title, an area that you want to look at, and rewrite it as a question. Okay. The only time we drop the question mark is when we finish the conclusion. Okay. It's a good bit of psychology, because as soon as you put that, a question mark at the end of it, as lawyers, we want to be able to answer the question. Okay. It stops you from simply stating, being descriptive, being matter of fact. Makes you think about it. And I also suggest think about putting the words "to what extent" in front of that question, or something of that nature. So to start thinking about, the degree to which something may be right or wrong, okay, or persuasive or not. And once you've done that, try and write your dissertation such as you can articulate it now. Okay, it may be a statement of what you want to do, right, in a page. Okay, and then as you go through the process, rewrite that sort of essence of my study, that single page, and trying to pull it all the way down to 500, 250 words. Okay, that should literally state, if you had to give a 15-second presentation, 30-second presentation on what your dissertation is, that is what you would read out, and everybody would understand what you're saying. Very difficult to do at the beginning. The reason why it's helpful to do is to keep you on point. Okay? Often when we start our research, we identify some really good articles. You might be reading a report, and then you end up going over here. It's like watching a YouTube video, isn't it? You watch the one that you want to watch, and then when you've finished it, there's a list of others, and they're broadly related. And then when you watch that, and by the time you watch the ones on the second and third degree, you're watching nothing like what you originally wanted to watch. And the research works in exactly the same way. Okay, so you really do need to stay on point, and the essence of your study is very helpful as just a tool. Okay, print it out, stick it on the desktop. So whenever you come to looking at an article or a case law, okay, you're saying fundamentally, is it relevant? Okay, is the first question you ask, and so you're constantly able to be much more efficient with the way in which you practically go about your research. Okay, because you need to be quite particular about the time that you spend. So once you have that title rewritten as a research question, you've got an essence of your study that you'll continue to iterate throughout the process. That can then become a précis, a summary, if you want to, at the beginning. Okay. Then identify a chapter structure. Okay. Try and write each of those chapter headings. Okay. Again, as questions. It's almost impossible to answer your overall research question. Yeah. To write that as a single question. It'll often beg further questions, sub-questions that you need to address first. Okay? Some would be obvious, okay? Definitional type questions, but write it as a question. And then you start identifying, and then just apply maybe each chapter to addressing each one of those questions. So give an indicative structure. Think about an indicative structure, but be prepared to revisit it. And then give your supervisors, some indication of the sources that you're looking at. Okay, so that's helpful for us to see where you're thinking the research needs to go. Okay, and when you pull all that together, you've got like your research proposal. So you probably, some of you may be further along than others in pulling that together. Don't think of, when I'm referring to a research proposal or a literature review, as separate tasks. Okay? You're thinking, I want to get Chris. No, I want just to write my dissertation. This is a good way in which to grow into that dissertation in a way that keeps you focused, because you don't want to necessarily waste any time just identifying an issue, writing a few notes, and then putting it to the side and starting the dissertation. So you start from that essence of the study, you start from your chapter structures, you start producing a research proposal. That's that reference point from which you can develop your dissertation. Okay? And I tend to work in the same Word document the entire time. Okay? Very rarely that I'll have notes over here, my dissertation here, I tend to write in the entire thing in the same Word document. Not least because you often, when you're going through it, you think, I'm sure I've made notes on that particular thing. All you need to do is just Control Find, and you find it very, very quickly. So make sure that in your research proposal, which you'll then expand into the dissertation, that you identify the research topic, the research question, and think about the methodology. That is the process that you will apply to the sources to answer that particular research question that you've identified. Okay. So this is much about what I've spoken about. So think about the working title. What's your objectives? What do you hope to achieve? So you may have an idea to write on a particular subject matter, and you see an issue, but this is an LLM, right? Not an MSc. We have to identify that legal hook. All right. You can talk about matters of commerciality. Everything has a commercial implication in most cases. Okay, you can talk about social legal issues, political issues that impact on it. But fundamentally, it's an LLM. Okay, so we do need that legal hook to identify a legal issue, or an issue that has legal consequences, or an issue that the law can hope to resolve. Okay. Question I sometimes get is, do I need to do a chapter, a section on stated, this is my research methodology? The answer is you don't need to do that. You may choose to do that if that's the way you want to approach it. Some people put it explicitly within a separate section. That's absolutely fine. Others may subsume it within the introduction, but still say I will adopt a doctrinal approach to assessing this, and that's fine equally. You'll see next time around, I didn't bother, and my dissertation didn't suffer from it, because the approach that I'd taken to analysing, doing the research, analysing the sources to answer the questions was quite implicit. So it was quite clear what approach I took. We don't require you to adopt a particular approach, as I've just said. It's just a technique that you use to identify the sources that you're using to answer your research question. All right? So to what topic to do? Again, so I said, choose a topic of interest to you, obviously, okay? But we also need to think of it in terms of how researchable is that topic? Are the questions raised by that topic sufficiently clear? Are they too highfalutin? Are they too hypothetical? Are they researchable? So, example, I want to compare the way the UK legal framework applies on a particular matter with how the Democratic Republic of the Congo, applies a similar issue, that may be very great and probably would prove to be a very interesting dissertation. But are you going to be able to access the sources you need to assess the state of affairs in the DRC and how that legal framework is operating? Very difficult to do. So we have to think about whether or not it's researchable. Has to be connected to established research and theory. That's an obvious point in a way, because you want to be able to identify sources that you can rely on, a piece of legislation, case law, articles. We're not expecting you will get distinctions if you just demonstrate an advanced understanding of the subject matter, disciplined in the way that you structure it, set out a research question, well researched and answered. There's a distinction. All right? You don't need to strike new ground, come up with some grand new legal theory. Some of you may do so, and that would be fantastic. But you don't need to, in that sense. You don't even need to have too much by way of original research, because that's more PhD. So just make it clear that it's connected to established research and an established theory in that sense, and you'll be absolutely fine. And of course, you want to be able to identify almost as many sources as possible of varying descriptions to enable you to pull your dissertation together. Some students struggle in a way to have confidence to include lots of sources and reference material when they're drafting their dissertation, I guess through fear of taking away their original authorship. But what I would say to that is the more you can include by way of reference material just shows us how learned the piece is going to be, how well researched the piece is going to be, and then it's just a question of how you've used those sources. Now, I'm sure if you've identified something that somebody else has written, and it answers the point, try and identify two other sources that address the point. And even if you then still say, I really couldn't have written that better myself, then there, you can use, you can quote, you can cite them, you can paraphrase them. Just make sure that you do use an appropriate citation. But the way in which you can actually write it, and we'll talk about this when we reconvene, is that you can state the answer that they have given you, their research has given you in terms of how persuasive it is. And then you say and then as stated by Smith, as illustrated by, so then and then you conclude by saying almost like, "See, I told you so." Okay, so almost in the you can state a particular source in that sandwiched way, where you state the position. You say, "See, it's supported by X, Y, Z." Okay, and then you restate the position. Okay, without unduly repeating it. And so make sure that when you're choosing the topic, that you have a topic that there is a sufficient amount of material out there so that you can do that. So enable you to make a contribution to the debate. So make sure there's scope for analysis and critique. Yes, I've talked about this in terms of not just simply writing on an interesting topic. Do try to identify a problem, an issue. Okay, so if you're writing on a topic there has been a fair amount of case law, can you identify a Supreme Court case where there's been only a majority decision? So is there a dissenting judgment you can read? If a law lorder's dissented on a particular matter, then they generally do so for a good reason, and something that you might want to look into as the basis for your issue. Do include analysis. Be critical. Be persuaded. Be ready to be persuaded to ask yourself difficult questions, whether or not you need to start arguing the contra argument. That could be fine too. But of course, it's absolutely critical in the process that you identify good authority. All right. So clearly, books, chapters, that's fine. Whatever book you might use. I mean, the example I've given here is more to do with the books you might use to support what methodology you used, as opposed to a particular subject matter. One of the questions I sometimes get is, there's the yellow tops. It could be contract law for dummies. The yellow tops. Can I use that? And I always say absolutely. Why not? It's published material, right? But all I would suggest to you is you may not want to reference it, okay? Because it is perhaps of less authority. It's less persuasive. My question to you would then be, can you not identify what they are stating in more authoritative sources? Okay, and I'm sure the answer is always going to be yes in that sense. But yes, books and chapters, of course. Journal articles. Does everybody know what a peer-reviewed article is? It's okay to say no. No? Quick explaining. Okay. So I'm not necessarily talking about newspaper articles in this sense. I'm talking about journal articles. And they come in various different forms. But with respect to the publication, you may come across different types of journal publications. It may just simply be an entirely online publication. Maybe it's by Institute for Advanced Legal Studies Student Law Review. Okay. But then equally, you might go and locate on Westlaw the Company Lawyer. Company Lawyer being a more professional publication, and is available by subscription. Often the authors are practitioners, senior academics. Okay, and equally you might look at an article published in the Modern Law Review or the Law Quarterly Review. Okay, and those two are certainly regarded in the academy as being sort of your 4-star journals. Okay, so and the reason I'm saying this is that clearly the material that will be published in these journals and the authors will be of varying different scholarship, okay, and authority that you would need to think about. But in all of those cases, they're examples of peer-reviewed journals. So that is where a particular submission by an author of a paper to the journal will first be considered for its relevance to the subject matter and scope of that journal, and if it's within the subject matter, then they'll think about whether or not it meets the standard of scholarship required. Okay, so they'll have an editorial panel and they'll have a peer review panel that will actually look at that, read it, and see if it's of a sufficient quality to publish in that publication. And then if obviously it's been through that process and is published, okay, then those of us coming to identifying it, okay, and we can rely on it to a greater extent than something that isn't necessarily peer reviewed. All right. So a lot of journal articles you can identify through the electronic resources, whether it's LexisNexis or Westlaw and so on. They're helpful. And equally, it may be helpful within those publications to have a quick look for an editorial comment, okay, or an update. Tend to be short, potentially sort of quite pithy type papers, okay. They will just summarise a particular topic. Maybe there's a new piece of legislation that's come out, okay, and they just simply summarise the key aspects of it. Very helpful for you as students to get into that subject matter quickly, as opposed to the more lengthy analysis type articles where they're going to fully articulate what the issue is, and you can see what method they've used, what sources they've used, and the arguments are going to be well made and thought out. Those sort of more lengthier analysis type articles are going to be quite helpful to you because they will include references that you can then refer to. So as you're going through, if something is of interest, and they themselves are citing a particular piece of legislation, maybe a regulatory rule, maybe a paper elsewhere, then you can go to that underlying source, review it, and apply it to your dissertation. Okay. Conference papers, think about those. Okay, there may be conferences that have been held on that, and some conferences are linked to journals. So the one that Professor Ryder runs every year at Cambridge, we've got the Journal of Money Laundering Control, Journal of Financial Crime. Both journals are linked to the conference. And obviously, to the extent that papers are delivered at conferences, they may not be fully developed. Okay, they may lack the citations required, for example. So just be cognizant of that. Yes, you can look at dissertations and theses. British Library, BPP, also publish a few dissertations in the library. They can be helpful, certainly with respect to the methodology and structures and how you might go about it as students. Probably less so in terms of the scholarship. Yes, reports. I always tend to see if the Law Commission, it's one of the first places I tend to go if I'm writing on something, to see if the Law Commission has done anything on it. So they have a fairly significant programme over a number of years, of course, and often the consultation papers that are put out and the reports are evidently extremely well written and researched and can be very helpful. But of course, if you identify a Law Commission paper, a consultation paper, and it's suggesting what the Law Commission thinks the law is or ought to be in terms of reform and so on, that one is just an opinion, but two, it'll be dated, right? So what you wouldn't want to do is then rely on that Commission paper and then find out, hopefully not too late, that the government's response to that was to disagree entirely with the recommendations and go and do something else. Okay, or maybe the market didn't agree with what the Commission or any author of any report, right? So clearly, it's only correct at the point of its publication as to what it's stating. But if there are certainly recommendations, make sure you trace through to the extent to which they've been taken up, and you can rely on those recommendations. Legislation and regulation, yes, of course. Where you're stating a point that is clearly codified and dealt with in regulation. We wouldn't expect you to be citing, Chris Steers, Company Lawyer 2018. Okay, right? If it's a fiduciary duties, definition of fiduciary duties, or the fiduciary duty of a company director, you would cite Section 172 of the Companies Act. You wouldn't cite somebody that's all, referring to it. Okay, right? So always look for the underlying source, the most persuasive source, and there is nothing more persuasive than the will of Parliament in legislation in that sense. Okay. Yes, it isn't always about codification and statute. Don't forget about case law, but also administrative law as well. Okay, so any of you are looking at doing something in sort of my area of expertise, financial regulation and compliance, is an awful lot of administrative law by way of regulation and so on. Okay, so the Financial Conduct Authority in this, has statutory powers to promulgate rules which will have the force of law. In fact, they have, potentially criminal implications by implication. So, think about whether or not there are other sources of law that you ought to be considering. Yes, case law I've touched on already. Bit 101 from undergrad. Yes, of course, you've got the ratio of a case. You've got obiter remarks. Okay, think about the way in which you might be able to use some of the obiter dicta comments by the judges as a source of ideas for further research. Yes, often we've looked at dissenting judgments in that way as well to identify an issue that's clearly has split the judiciary. So why wouldn't we look at that more closely? Non-academic items. So can I cite Wikipedia? Can I cite the Daily Mirror? Again, I would say yes, of course you can. But is there a better, more informed alternative talking about the same subject matter? I highly suspect you could find that. Clearly, it may well be a fantastic source to use something that has been written in The Guardian, what's Boris Johnson talking about now, or it may be something that the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times has talked about. Think that could be incredibly helpful if you're dealing with an issue of and that has sort of current affairs implications. By all means, cite those. All right? But do think about that publication. No disrespect to the Sun newspaper, for example. Okay, be great in many other ways. But if I had an article from the Sun, and I had an article from the Financial Times talking about the same thing, I'm probably more likely to use the Financial Times in that situation. So yes, it's wise for the researcher to avoid the use of non-academic items over established areas of laws. I think I mentioned that quite clearly. And this because they've got a relatively low validity of content in comparison to most of the other sources. All right? And so finally, your literature review. So you started to think about your research question, you started to plot the research proposal, but we don't really know what those questions are just yet, so you need to go out and identify what's currently written on the subject. This isn't a 5-week endeavour, okay? Set yourself a deadline, okay? I'm going to just do a literature review, make some notes, get an idea of what all of the issues are in this area for the next week, okay? And then I'm going to seek to put down that essence of my study, and then I'm going to set a meeting with my supervisor to discuss where I am at the moment. And to segue back into that, lead that relationship with your supervisors. Okay, right? I've had students that I've exchanged a telephone conversation or emails at the beginning, and then have never met them, okay? Or I meet them with 10 days to go, okay? And that's the first time I've seen everything, despite asking to see things. And equally, there's those that communicate every other day. And you have to strike a balance. I always encourage students to try to get chapters drafted and then give me chapters as you go through, okay? But always include, always build it within the same Word document is helpful, because even if you haven't done later chapters, I can see how you're thinking about flowing, the logic flows through to your conclusion. It's very, very helpful. And if you need, you should definitely meet with your supervisors if it's logistically possible, okay? And if further supervisory meetings are needed, wanted, then your supervisors will do whatever they can to accommodate that. One point of formality, though, you'll know, because everyone in the room will have read the dissertation guidelines that are available on the VLE that Professor Ryder authored many years ago. You'll know that we're not allowed to comment on your dissertations in 3 weeks prior to the submission date. We have to set a cut-off date there. Okay? That's to ensure that everybody has a level playing field in terms of supervisory consultation straight away, all the way through towards the end. So be disciplined in that research. Be disciplined in getting the writing over. I always am, I am not interested in seeing the most articulate, well-presented, thought-out writing when submitting a draft chapter. I don't like to see 5 words on a bullet point either. So somewhere in between, because it's a draft, okay? So, do submit work to the supervisors for comment. And to start now in pulling that literature review together, you want to be thinking about the matters that have been dealt with to your satisfaction and can be aptly covered with reference to someone else's, okay? Answered by others, but not to your satisfaction. So, but of course, when we get to, an issue on that subject matter, remember to state why you disagree and explain how you'll answer that. And then finally, are there any issues not answered, and so you'll seek to fill the gap. Now, again, this could very well be more PhD. Okay, so all you really need to be thinking about is that you don't need to strike new ground necessarily. Okay, if you can identify a scenario where the law is having to be applied, but it doesn't quite fit. It's not fit for purpose. Then great. That's here. The law has answered a particular set of facts or a scenario, but not to a particular satisfaction. So maybe this is probably where you will all tend to focus in terms of what you're seeking to answer. Okay. Oh yes, in terms of when you're going about your research, yes, set a week, set a couple of weeks at most, okay, to get some preliminary research down, okay, start putting it into the research question. Where do you think it fits in, okay? But be disciplined as you go through one source to another, okay? So read that abstract, read the summary. If it's of relevance, continue to read it. If not, stop reading it. Don't throw it away, leave it for another day, okay? But if it's relevant, then move to the introduction, okay? Then read the conclusion. Make sure you appreciate the methodology they've used, okay? And then the results and analysis in that order, because then again you can be more efficient in extracting the notes at this stage, okay? And then of course you need to record those elements of the paper that are relevant, okay? And then those notes you'll end up expanding on them, adding in citations, pulling in the arguments, and ultimately will end up being the final piece. But that early research is really important because it will help you focus, rewrite again that research question. Okay? And then everything else. And then once you've got that broadly, you've identified the issues, you can then use the later research to help you answer that particular question that you've identified. So to questions, are there any? No? Easy, isn't it? Off you go. No, that's great. Okay, so I think we're reconvening next week, or is it next week? So next week, when we'll talk about the research methods, I'll touch on primary research, and then we'll go through more the practical steps of how you might organise your research and start writing. Okay? Great. And then the first thing you should do after you finish this lecture is send an email to your supervisors or confirm that first meeting. All right? Excellent. Make sure that you sign the attendance. Yeah, that's about right, isn't it? I think it's right. You can get access. They'll give you a temporary pass. Not good. Okay, we like ambition, but yeah, that's there. You do have to rein it in a little bit. Specific area of financial crime. So you must be thinking about a number of different financial crimes. Very important. Yeah, never mind that. So that's part of it. But I'd imagine you could probably do that. So yeah, the UK